I didn't wake up one morning knowing something was wrong. There was no panic, and no breakdown, and no dramatic moment where everything collapsed. Instead, there was a quiet certainty that arrived slowly, the kind that doesn't shout, but doesn't leave either. I was 42 years old when I realized I had become very good at a life I never consciously chose. I had built it carefully, brick by brick, decision by decision. From the outside, it looked solid. From the inside, it felt borrowed. My days were predictable in the way people often mistake for peace. Wake up early, answer emails, meetings stacked neatly back to back, evenings filled with responsibilities that left little room for reflection. I told myself I liked structure. What I really liked was not having to ask myself difficult questions. People admire my discipline. They call me focused, reliable, successful. I accepted those words without protest, even though none of them described how I felt when I was alone, because how I felt didn't seem relevant. That's what adulthood teaches you, or at least that's what I believed. The first crack appeared in an unexpected way, not through loss, but through praise. During a company dinner, my manager stood up and spoke about my dedication, my loyalty, my long-term commitment. He said, "If more people followed your example, things would be simpler." The room applauded. I smiled and felt absolutely nothing. That emptiness stayed with me long after the applause faded. Not sadness, disconnection, as if someone had just described a version of me that existed on paper, but not in my body. That night, driving home, I asked myself a question I had avoided for decades. If everything is going so well, why do I feel so distant from my own life? I thought about the path that had brought me here. None of it was reckless, none of it impulsive. I chose safety early, a practical degree, a stable career, a lifestyle that rewarded consistency over curiosity. At the time, it felt like maturity. In hindsight, it felt like fear wearing a responsible mask. I hadn't failed. That was the uncomfortable part. Failure would have given me something to blame. But I had succeeded, and still felt misplaced. I noticed it in small moments. When someone asked what I enjoyed doing, and I answered with what I was good at instead. When weekends felt like recovery periods instead of opportunities. When silence felt heavier than noise. I had optimized my life for efficiency, not fulfillment. And efficiency had quietly replaced desire. The question grew louder over time. Who is this all for? I tried to ignore it. I told myself this was normal. That longing was childish. That satisfaction was overrated. That meaning was something people invented when they had too much time. But the more I dismissed it, the more persistent it became. It followed me into conversations. Friends talked about dreams they were chasing, changes they were making. I listened politely, then changed the subject. Not because I disagreed, because I felt exposed. One evening, while sorting through old boxes in storage, I found a notebook from my early 20s. Unplanned, unintentional. I opened it without expectation and felt something tighten in my chest. The pages were filled with questions, ideas, fragments, curiosity. Not plans, possibilities. I didn't recognize the voice, but I knew it was mine. A version of me that asked why before asking how. I sat on the floor longer than I intended, reading, remembering, grieving something I hadn't realized I'd lost. That was when I understood something important. I hadn't abandoned my dreams. I had slowly replaced them with obligations. And, at some point, I stopped noticing the difference. A few days later, I met her. Not at work, not through friends. By accident. It was a rainy afternoon, and I had ducked into a small bookstore to wait out the weather. She was standing near the philosophy section, holding a book she didn't seem to be reading, more like considering. Her name was Hannah. She asked me if I'd read the book before. I hadn't. We talked, casually, then deeply. The way conversations go when neither person is trying to impress the other. She asked what I did. I gave a usual answer. She nodded, then asked, "And who are you when you're not doing that?" The question landed harder than it should have. I smiled, didn't answer. She noticed. "That wasn't a challenge," she said gently. "I'm just curious." Curiosity. I hadn't been met with that in a long time. We talked until the rain stopped. then kept talking anyway. About choices, about paths we follow without questioning, about the quiet fear of disappointing people by changing. She spoke honestly, not dramatically, but precisely, like someone who had already asked herself the questions I was only beginning to notice. Before we parted, she said something that stayed with me. Comfort can be a very convincing substitute for truth. I went home unsettled, not because of her, because of what she had named. That night, I lay awake, replaying the conversation, realizing how long it had been since someone had spoken to me as if my inner life mattered. Not my performance, not my role, my interior. I didn't know what Hannah would become in my life. I only knew this. She had appeared at the exact moment I could no longer pretend I was merely tired. I was misaligned, and once you recognize misalignment, everything that once felt stable starts to feel temporary. After meeting Hannah, I didn't suddenly decide to change my life. That would have been easier to explain. Instead, I did what I had always done best. I compartmentalized. I returned to my routines with renewed precision, as if discipline could drown out doubt. Work became busier, schedules tighter, evenings fuller. If I stayed occupied long enough, maybe the questions would lose their urgency. They didn't. Hannah didn't intrude. She didn't message every day, didn't ask where I was going or what I planned to do. She appeared occasionally, a conversation here, a coffee there. And every time we spoke, she didn't add pressure. She added clarity. "You seem loyal," she said once, "not to people, to systems." I laughed, then paused, because again, she wasn't wrong. I had always believed loyalty was a virtue. Stay committed, don't abandon what you've built. Finish what you start. But no one ever told me that loyalty, when unquestioned, can quietly turn into self-betrayal. The tension began showing up in places I couldn't control. At work, I felt irritated by conversations I used to tolerate. Meetings felt longer. Goals felt hollow. I started noticing how often decisions were made out of habit rather than intention, including my own. One afternoon, a colleague asked if I wanted to pursue a promotion. It was the logical next step, the expected one. I nodded automatically, then heard myself say, "Let me think about it." The room went quiet. That had never been my answer before. That night, I walked instead of driving. I needed to feel the city move around me. I realized something unsettling. I had built a life where change felt like betrayal, not just to others, but to the version of myself who had worked so hard to get here. Hannah and I talked more openly, not about romance, about cost. The cost of staying, the cost of leaving, the cost of becoming honest too late. She never told me what to do. She simply asked what I was willing to pay. "I'm afraid," I admitted one evening. "Of failing?" she asked. "No," I said. "Of succeeding at something I don't believe in anymore." She nodded, as if she had been there. The conflict reached my personal life soon after. Friends noticed I was distracted, less agreeable, more hesitant. "You're overthinking," one of them said. "You've got a good thing going." I smiled, because that sentence had once reassured me. Now it felt like a warning. I thought about the version of myself people depended on. The reliable one, not the consistent one, the one who never disrupted the flow. What would happen if I stopped being him? Who would I disappoint? That question haunted me. Not what would I lose, but who would I let down? Because my life wasn't just mine anymore. It was woven into expectations. Hannah sensed my hesitation. "You don't owe honesty to everyone at once," she said. "But you owe it to yourself first." That idea felt radical. Self-honesty as obligation. The following weeks felt like living in two parallel lives. One where everything continued as planned. Another where everything felt provisional. I started imagining alternatives. Not fantasies, possibilities. And that frightened me more than dissatisfaction ever had. One evening, I revisited the notebook from my 20s. Read the questions again. This time, they didn't feel naive. They felt unfinished. I realized something painful. I had been loyal to a future version of myself that no longer existed. And staying faithful to him meant abandoning who I was becoming. The pressure built quietly, until one morning, standing in the mirror, I didn't recognize the expression on my face. Not tired. Resigned. That was new. That day, I declined the promotion. Not with a speech. With a sentence. I don't think this is the direction I want to go. Saying it felt like stepping off a ledge. The ground didn't disappear, but it shifted. The consequences were immediate. Confusion. Concern. Questions I wasn't ready to answer. But beneath the fear, something else appeared. Relief. I told Hannah later that night. She listened, then said softly, "That's usually how truth enters, quietly, but irreversibly." I knew then that there was no going back. I hadn't changed my life yet, but I had broken my silence. And once silence is broken, the life built on it begins to ask for answers. After I declined the promotion, nothing collapsed. That surprised me. I had expected confrontation, disappointment, maybe even anger. Instead, the world adjusted, slowly, awkwardly, as if my refusal had created a pause no one knew how to fill. And in that pause, I felt something unfamiliar. Agency. People ask questions, some out of concern, some out of curiosity, some out of quiet judgment. I answer what I could. I'm reevaluating. I need time. I'm not sure yet. Those words used to scare me. Now they felt honest. Hannah and I continued talking, but something shifted. Our conversations became heavier, not because of emotion, but because of consequence. We weren't discussing ideas anymore. We were discussing direction. "What happens if you keep going?" she asked one evening. "I stay comfortable," I said. "And if you stop?" "I lose certainty." She nodded. "And which loss feels more bearable?" That question followed me for days. The deeper I went, the clearer it became. I wasn't afraid of failing at something new. I was afraid of being seen trying openly, imperfectly, without guarantees. My old life had protected me from that exposure. The shift began quietly. I started speaking differently, more slowly, more carefully, not because I was unsure, but because I was choosing. I stopped filling silence to maintain ease. I let discomfort exist. Some people drifted away, not dramatically. They simply stopped calling. We had been connected by routine, not resonance. And without the routine, there was nothing to hold us together. That hurt more than I expected. Others leaned in. They asked questions, shared their own doubts. It turned out my honesty gave them permission. That realization humbled me. Hannah remained steady, not as a guide, as a witness. One night, I asked her why she stayed present through all of this. She smiled. "Because you're finally in your own life," she said. "That's rare." I eventually made the decision to leave my job, not impulsively, with planning, with fear, with clarity. I didn't know exactly what came next, but for the first time, I knew what couldn't continue. The day I handed in my resignation, my hand shook, not from regret, from release. The weeks that followed were disorienting. Time felt different, slower, less defined. Without my old identity, I had to confront who I was without it. That was harder than I expected. I questioned myself constantly. Had I romanticized change? Was this just restlessness? Would I regret this when comfort disappeared? But beneath the doubt, there was alignment, a quiet sense of rightness. Hannah and I grew closer, not in urgency, in honesty. There was no promise of permanence, just presence, and that felt enough. One afternoon, walking together, she said something that stayed with me. "Not every dream is loud. Some are just the absence of pretending." I understood exactly what she meant. Months passed. I built something new, slowly. Not a perfect life, a truthful one. Work that felt connected to my values, days that felt chosen, silence that felt restorative instead of heavy. I still miss the ease of my old life sometimes, the predictability, the applause, but I don't miss the numbness. Looking back, I realized I wasn't living someone else's dream. I was living a version of my own that had been edited for approval. Letting go wasn't rebellion. It was reclamation. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Comfort will never ask you who you are, but truth always will. And answering it costs something. It costs safety. It costs certainty. It costs the version of you that learned to survive instead of choose. I don't know where this path leads, but for the first time, I know it's mine. And that makes all the difference.